Great, thank you, Steve. Right, well, thank you very much for all of you for coming on this sunny afternoon. I'm sure there are better things that you could do. And as I look across the audience, I know that Steve has thrown down that rather weighty gauntlet, and I see much more expertise in front of me than is at this podium. So don't feel that you need to challenge Steve on that. But more importantly, as I look across the crowd, I see different stages of my career of working on Iraq, both in coming repeatedly to Washington and then working in Baghdad, and then certainly speaking and giving papers at conferences across Europe. So thank you for all that. And I think to speak to the Institute for a minute, I think it's especially apt that the launch of Iraq from war to a new authoritarianism should be chaired by Stephen Simon. As you know, Steve has just left the National Security Council as Senior Director for the Middle East and North Africa to run both the IISS Middle East operations and indeed the office here in DC. More importantly, for me at least, Steve and I have been arguing about and jointly working on the evolution of Iraqi politics since at least the last time Steve left the NSC to work for the IISS in 1999. Our jointly edited book, Iraq at a Crossroads, State and Society in the Shadow of Regime Change, was dreamt up on a very long car ride between Abu Dhabi and Dubai in 2002, and then published in 2003, just before the invasion. And I think a lot of the issues that I've been wrestling with in this book were first touched upon in that book. And I think we were lucky enough to bring together a full panoply of Iraq experts when I was very much their junior. So it's been a long time since then. So I think it's especially apt that Steve is chairing this launch on his second work at the IISS, I believe. Right, now, Iraq from war to new authoritarianism represents my attempt to understand the evolution of Iraqi politics and society from the invasion in 2003 right up until today. This task firstly focused on seeking to understand that rising tide of violence that we all witnessed that came to dominate the country after regime change until maybe at least 2007, 2008. And the book sets out to examine what I've delineated as the three major drivers of violence. First, the undoubted use of sectarian rhetoric, sectarian ideology that stresses communal, religious, and ethnic identity to mobilize first voters in the two elections of 2005, and then, to be frank, to justify the sectarian violence as Iraq entered civil war. Second, the collapse of the state, which is a big theme in a lot of my work after regime change. Now, this state collapse was not only heralded most infamously by the disbanding of the Iraqi armed forces, but also, and I think currently much more importantly, by the inability of the Iraqi government to deliver basic services like electricity, sewage, and clean running water to the majority of its population for anything like the majority of time. And I think finally, hopefully, where this book kind of pushes the argument forward is the third cause of the violence that was the political system itself set up after 2003. Now, in the book, we were talking at lunch about pacted transitions, the deals that are done to move a country either from authoritarianism to democracy or from civil war to peace. And the book looks at what I've called an exclusive elite pact that was put in place after 2003 to empower a comparatively small number of politicians, a lot of whom had been exiled, who organised their appeal to the voters around religious identity, and this elite pact brought them into government, but deliberately excluded a section of society believed, I think rather unfairly, to be closely associated with the previous regime, and unsurprisingly, it's from that section of society that the insurgency grew. The book then goes on to assess if the US government and then the Iraqi government it empowered have effectively dealt with the drivers of this civil war. And there's a long chapter on the theory and application of counter-insurgency theory to Iraq that some of us in the room lived through. The conclusions, however, are what we're here to think about today, or what I thought would be most interesting. They're sobering and I think very pessimistic. Now, the Iraqi military has certainly been effectively rebuilt. It now employs 930,000 people. I think it's Tony Corderson's figures that estimate this is equal to 8% of the country's entire workforce and 12% of the total population of adult men. However, the civilian capacity of the Iraqi state is still woefully inadequate. In 2011, the United Nations estimated that only 26% of the population were covered by a public sewage network. This leaves 83% of the wastewater in Iraq untreated. Overall, the UN figures suggest that 7.6 million people, or 25% of the population, lack access to safe drinking water. Nationwide surveys carried out by the Iraqi Knowledge Network in 2011 found that the average household received just 7.6 hours of electricity from the national grid each day. So 79% of those surveyed thought that electricity delivery was bad and getting worse. This is in spite of the fact that by March 2012, the United States and Iraqi governments had spent $200.4 billion trying to reconstruct the Iraqi state. However, this afternoon I want to focus not on the failure of reconstruction, not on the drivers of violence, but the final part of the book that examines the evolution of Iraqi politics, especially since the last elections of 2010. And I thought to do this, I'd start off with a single significant event that a lot of you know occurred on the afternoon of Thursday, the 20th of December 2012. That afternoon, government security forces raided the house of Iraq's finance minister, Dr. Rafi al-Isawi. Isawi is a leading member of the Iraqi coalition that in 2010 won a slim majority of the seats in parliament, 91 to 89 and a 62% turnout. After an extended period of increasingly fraught negotiations, the incumbent Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki retained his job at the head of a new government of national unity. I think Isawi is one of the most important appointments of those negotiations. He was given the portfolio of the Minister of Finance, making him probably the most powerful Iraqi politician in government. And since he was appointed to that job, Isawi had won plaudits for his professional handling of his portfolio and stood out, I would argue, for his willingness to rise above the political crisis that has racked Iraq for all of 2012 and get on with his job. Isawi had shown himself to be a capable leader and an administrator, in contrast, let's be frank, to some of his higher profile colleagues in Iraq here. It was surprising, given this background then, that when government troops rushed into his house, arresting 5 of his bodyguard and forcing Isawi himself to seek refuge in the house of the Speaker of Parliament, his fellow Iraqi politician Osama Najafi. Now what was surprising is powerful, one of the most important politicians in the cabinet picked up the phone and called the Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, to see if he'd authorised the raid. Reporting has it that Maliki refused to take his call. Then, in the sanctuary of Najafi's house, he held a press conference arguing, quote, Maliki now wants just to get rid of his partners, to build up a dictatorship. He wants to consolidate power more and more. Now, the raid on Isawi's house was so important because it triggered disturbing comparisons to a similar event almost a year before on a raid against Vice President Tariq al-Hashimi's house. He was charged with terrorism and then driven into exile. Interestingly, the raid on Isawi occurred a short time after he publicly joined a national coalition along with Osama al-Najafi to fight the provincial elections of April 2013. The arrest of Isawi's bodyguard escalated the political crisis that had been rumbling on since Hashimi's arrest a year before, with a series of demonstrations in Ramadi and Fallujah escalating to the point where 7 people were killed and 59 people wounded after police opened fire on the demonstrations in Fallujah last Friday. And in a grim, almost ominous thing, in retaliation, insurgents killed 2 soldiers and snatched 3 more on Saturday. Now let's try and put this incident in broader perspective and turn to explain how the raid on Isawi's house is representative of what I've called in the title of the book, The Rise of a New Authoritarianism in Iraq. Nouri al-Maliki was first appointed Prime Minister in 2006 after another set of extended negotiations, another government of national unity that followed the elections of December 2005. Now, ironically, one of the reasons why Maliki was appointed was as a compromise candidate because he was seen to pose no threat to the other competing members of the ruling elite. He was seen as kind of grey functionary, and his party, Dawa, did not have a militia of its own, so he was thought to lack the charisma and indeed the military muscle to pose a threat. Now, upon taking office in April 2006, Maliki was indeed confronted by the very issue that had allowed him to be appointed in the first place. He lacked the political power through which to govern. And we could discuss why that was in questions and answers, but clearly he didn't have the levers, the institutional capacity to deliver services, to deliver political decisions to the population whose votes had finally resulted in his taking the office of the Prime Minister. Now, Maliki's first move in his quest to secure his grip on power was to gain control over his immediate political constituency, the Islamic Dawa Party itself. He then built a small and cohesive group of functionaries, what Joel Rabin, in an excellent piece, have described as the Malikiyun, a group of functionaries tied to him personally and then used as an elite vehicle to consolidate his grip on state power. The Malikiyun are comprised of close family members, his son, nephew and son-in-law, who occupy sensitive positions in the Prime Minister's office, and then beyond that, Dawa Party functionaries who've aligned themselves with the Prime Minister once he took control of the state and the party. Now, Maliki, when faced with a fractious national political elite, consumed as they still are with infighting and self-enrichment, placed these people, this tight group of Fens followers and faction members, at the centre of a network of influence and patronage that simply sought to bypass the divided cabinet and then interact from the Prime Minister's office directly with the senior civil servants and senior military figures exercising power on a day-to-day level across Iraq. Now, in effect, from 2006 onwards, what Maliki did was build a shadow state, circumventing the existing government elite empowered after regime change. This new organisational structure places the office of the Prime Minister at the centre of state power, reducing the ability of the cabinet to influence the formation and application of policy. He appointed his son Ahmed Maliki. He appointed his son Ahmed Maliki as Deputy Chief of Staff, giving him the oversight role. It's always the jokes you don't tell that are the best. The oversight role across all of Iraq's security services, making him personally responsible for his father's security. Now, Maliki's use of Iraq's security services to personally and politically protect himself reached its pinnacle at the end of March 2008 when he perceived a coordinated plot to unseat him. The plot basically, as we understand it, was to foment violent unrest in Basra as a trigger for a vote of no confidence in the parliament in Baghdad. He then sent, to outflank this, Maliki launched the Charge of the Knights, sent 4 divisions of the Iraqi army into Basra to seize control of the city back from the militias he perceived were posing a direct threat to himself. Maliki then went on to bolster his newfound popular appeal in May 2008 by imposing state control over the Sadr city area in Baghdad, the huge slum that until then had been the power base of Muqtada al-Sadr's Jaysh al-Mahdi. Maliki used this victory, I think very effectively, very astutely, to stamp his authority on the Iraqi government, on the armed forces, and to stand before the Iraqi populace, claiming that he was indeed an Iraqi nationalist, and it was his actions that had delivered order, some degree of order that had ended the civil war. Now, this new position clearly worked in the 2009 provincial elections, where his coalition, State of Law, won the largest slice of the popular vote in 9 of the 14 participating provinces. Now, Maliki attempted to use this wave, to use the provincial elections to catapult himself into the national elections of March 2010. However, unlike the previous 2005 sets of national elections, Maliki refused to join a united coalition designed to maximise the Shia vote and deliver it into Parliament. Instead, he chose to run exclusively on the State of Law platform. This, along with a rising current of nationalism that had helped him in the Iraqi provincial elections, allowed the secular nationalist opposition coalition, Iraqia, to win this slim majority of 91 seats to 89. Now, in a series of interviews I've done very recently with people close to Maliki at that time, it was that election victory, they claim, that propelled him into this kind of new muscular authoritarianism. In the period following the vote, Maliki's behaviour became indeed increasingly authoritarian. He issued a statement saying, quote, "No way will we accept the results." He bluntly stated that, he bluntly demanded a recount in order to prevent, quote, "a return to violence." Now, the potentially sinister implications of this statement were exacerbated by in light of the fact that he deliberately issued that statement in his role as head of the country's armed forces. Now, as we know, in mid-May 2010, after a recount, the Electoral Commission, backed by the United Nations, announced that it had found no evidence of fraud. And I think the High Electoral Commission is a great example of a brave and useful organisation. However, Maliki then deployed a tried and tested formula of first encouraging divisions within the rest of the Iraqi ruling elite, exploiting the lack of rules governing politicians' behaviour, and then again building a network of informal power structures across the government. He basically outweighted out the ruling elite, and the ruling elite were more worried, I think, by an Iraqi vote and what that might mean for a post-invasion political system than they were worried about his evidence of his increasing authoritarianism. This resulted in the November 2010 Erbil Agreement. Now, for the first 7 months after the Erbil Agreement, Maliki rejected, the Erbil Agreement was specifically designed to limit Maliki's growing power, to put politicians non-aligned to him in the Ministries of Interior and Ministers of Defence. For the first 7 months, he simply refused to allow independent politicians to be appointed to those two ministries. In June 2011, he picked a close advisor as acting Minister of National Security, and then in August he picked the Minister of Culture, Sardoun al-Dalemi, a very nice politician but a weak politician without a national base, as acting Minister of Defence, keeping acting Minister of Interior to himself. Now, by designating weak politicians or people personally tied to himself as acting minister, Maliki managed to retain control over the army, police force and intelligence service. And by designating them acting, he didn't have to put them before Parliament for them to be voted on and passed by parliamentarians. He's basically circumvented both the Erbil Agreement and the constitutional demands that cabinet posts be validated by Parliament. Now, in June and July this year, there was a lot of speculation about a vote of no confidence. And I interviewed a very senior parliamentarian about this question. And it sticks in my mind. He rocked back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and said, if we move towards a vote of no confidence, do you really think he would allow members to reach the chamber? And if they did, do you really think he'd take any notice? So in addition, Maliki's deployed an increasingly pliable judiciary to weaken the existing institutional oversights on how he ruled. In 2010, the Higher Judicial Council ruled that new legislation could only be proposed by Cabinet, not Parliament. And if you think of the significance of that, last Saturday, as a lot of you know, the Parliament voted 170 to 242 to limit the term of the Prime Minister to 2 terms. Of course, the Higher Judicial Council has made that ruling largely irrelevant. In January 2011, Chief Justice Mahmoud ruled that a series of previously independent and powerful oversight agencies set up by the Coalition Provisional Authority, the Committee of Integrity, the Independent High Electoral Commission, the Central Bank of Iraq, the High Commission for Human Rights, were all now subject to direct cabinet oversight. The cabinet is fractious and incoherent. That's basically giving influence over those supposedly independent organisations to the office of the Prime Minister. In October 2012, the widely respected and incredibly brave head of the central bank, Sinan al-Shabibi, and his deputy were indicted on corruption charges. Shabibi was quickly replaced as the head of the central bank by Abdul Basit Turki, who'd previously been appointed by Maliki to head up the anti-corruption organisation, the Board of Supreme Audit. Finally, in April 2012, the then head of the Independent High Electoral Committee was arrested on what were piffling charges of corruption. On his second night in jail, his mobile rings, who should it be? The Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki said, "This has got nothing to do with me, but I'll make sure you get out." What a powerful expression of the Prime Minister's control over formerly independent organisations and the people who staff them. Maliki directly blamed the Independent High Electoral Commission for robbing him of an electoral majority in the national elections of 2010. So the arrest of Assawi's bodyguard in December 2012 is the latest step in what I would argue is Maliki's long-running strategy of centralizing power, political power, in his own hands. If this wasn't worrying in itself, then what he's done to the security forces, I think, is even more worrying. Since his appointment in 2006, Maliki, with his own political vulnerability in mind, has used the office of the Prime Minister to cement his control over the army, the special forces, and finally the intelligence services. He's done this by setting up two either non-constitutional or extra-constitutional organizations. The first is the Office of the Commander-in-Chief, that was originally envisaged by US military advisors as a coordinating body. Maliki immediately saw its capacity, expanded it, staffed it with loyalists, and brought the Office of the Commander-in-Chief into the Office of the Prime Minister. The Office of the Commander-in-Chief then began to issue orders directly to battalion heads using their personal mobile phones, thus circumventing and in effect destroying the chain of command that would have led from the Ministry of Defence all the way through to on-the-ground operations. He then set up a second extra-constitutional innovation, operations centres, to do something even to break the army chain of command even more. Commencing in February 2007, the Baghdad security plan set up the Baghdad Operation Command that was designed to make more coherent the use of both the army and the police in Baghdad during the surge. Maliki went on to set up a series of provincial command centres across the south and central, and most controversially, most recently in the northwest of Iraq. Now again, the centres brought together the command and control of both the police and the army under one general in each province. Those generals, unsurprisingly, were chosen and directed from the central office in Baghdad under Maliki's command. Thus, the provincial command centres undermine the Ministry of Defence command and control of the army and give Maliki the appointment to direct the most important generals in the most strategically sensitive areas across the country. Finally, Maliki seized control of Iraqi Special Operations Forces, roughly comprising 4,200 soldiers. These people are considered to be the best special forces organisation in the Middle East by the people who trained them, the US military. In April 2007, as managerial responsibility was transferred from US Special Forces to the Iraqi government, Maliki set up a ministerial body, the Counter-Terrorism Bureau, to control it. This again effectively removed the Special Operations Forces from parliamentary oversight and delivered them to Maliki's control. They've become known across Iraq as the Fedayeen al-Maliki, a grim reference to their reputation as the Prime Minister's tool for covert action against his rivals, as well as some of you know from their laugh of bleakly ironic comparison to Saddam's own militias. And finally, we can go into detail in the Q&A, but basically he sought to purge intelligence officers from the intelligence services, bring them into his own command, in effect breaking or at least severely damaging their ability to lift, analyse and operationalise intelligence. Now, what are the reasons for this move back to a form of authoritarianism? I think the first is very obvious. Iraq's been through a traumatic, bloody civil war. Civil society activists, politicians who during that civil war were brave enough to stick their head above the parapet and use non-violent political means of organisation, very often rounded up being murdered. So political activism has huge costs, especially in a society that still has sectarian rhetoric as a main mobiliser, that divides groups not according to geography or class or ideology, but religious belief and ethnic identity. Now, the second thing I think is the great tragedy of the invasion and its aims to socio-politically re-engineer the country. Now, of course, in May 2003, we know that the Coalition Provisional Authority disbanded the military, I think in an explicit attempt to try and move Iraq out of a historical trajectory that had seen it have the first coup in the post-colonial Middle East and had seen regime change happen much more frequently through military action than through elections. However, in April 2004, the US faced the dual rebellions against them, one centered on Fallujah and one driven by Muqtada al-Sadr's militias. Desertion rates across the new armed forces when faced with these two revolts reached 30% in northeastern Iraq, 49% in Baghdad, and 30% across the south of Iraq. Faced with the problems of building a new army, the US set up the Multinational Security Transition Command Iraq and set about much more quickly, much more scientifically, reconstituting an Iraqi army. So basically, and unsurprisingly, and I think very understandably, the US, when faced with what was an insurgency mutating into a civil war, built as quickly as possible a new Iraqi army. By 2008, the US planned to increase the target size of the Iraqi military to 560,000 men. By 2011, $24.5 billion had been spent attempting to reconstitute the Iraqi armed forces. And as I said before, in January 2012, the Iraqi security forces employed a total of 933,103 people. And I thank SIGA for those figures. So the rapid expansion in the size and strength of this armed forces raises troubling questions over the military's ability to threaten, or the military's use to threaten, Iraq's fledgling democracy. Across the post-colonial Middle East, regime change was much more likely to be delivered by military coup than political uprising or democratic election. Iraq suffered the Middle East's first post-colonial coup in 1937. With 940,000 people currently employed by the security services, this gives a massive power to whoever controls the military. As I've said, Nouri al-Maliki, for his own political reasons, has gone out of his way at removing that military from parliamentary oversight. That gives him and his office an immense amount of power. Now, if we juxtapose the strength of the armed forces against a huge weakness of civil institutions, this brings a problem reminiscent to anyone who's studied post-colonial politics in the developing world. For a population, for a civil society to defend the institutions of the state against authoritarianism, they've got to recognize that those civil institutions are delivering to them what they need: electricity, clean running water, jobs, whatever it is. The Iraqi state is so weak that it's not delivering on both. And so the Iraqi state's presence within society continues to be regarded as fleeting or coercive. If we add to this the fact that the Iraqi budget is driven by, is 90% delivered by oil revenues, that the Iraqi state since 2005 has moved from 1.2 million to 2.3 million employees. The Ministry of Planning, as early as 2006, estimated that the state employs 31% of Iraq's labour force, and estimated this would rise to 35%. What we have is an overdeveloped military and a classic example of a rentier state. A population that doesn't see its state, and a ruling elite that doesn't need to extract much from its population. I think this brings me to the conclusions, the grim conclusions of the talk. The raid on Rafi al-Issawi's house triggered a large demonstration at the end of December in Ramadi, 100,000 people, Fallujah, 60,000 people. Issawi himself made a speech in Ramadi in which he denounced the arrest of his security detail, the politicization of the judiciary, and the regime's corruption. Now, does this herald a return to the mass violence that drove Iraq into civil war? On one side, I'd argue the 2.85 million people who voted for Iraq here in March 2010 have seen the role that their elected representatives play in government systematically reduced, and with the raid on Issawi potentially expelled from the cabinet and the government. The continuation of this of this rough and ready form of politics means that the population who voted, who invested their faith in the ballot box, have got precious little to show for it. And unsurprisingly, you could argue that the demonstrations in Ramadi and Fallujah have stoked a new radicalization, a new alienation. Iraqi and US government experts estimate that this political situation has allowed Al-Qaeda to double Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, to double its size of its membership from 1,000 in 2011 to anything between 2,500 and 3,000 in October 2012. However, history, I don't think, repeats itself. I doubt very much that we're heading back into civil war for the very reasons that I've delineated. Firstly, the violence, although terrible and undoubtedly rising, is concentrated in the provinces of Baghdad, Salahuddin, Diyala, Anbar, and Nineveh. In these 5 most violent provinces, incidents are usually concentrated in specific urban areas: Mosul, Baghdad, Baquba, Fallujah, and Ramadi. And I think this is because the security services, so rapidly and extensively rebuilt, are undoubtedly and will remain the most powerful force within Iraqi society. Now, the Iraqi state is clearly unable to stop the growth of Al-Qaeda within limits. It's unable to stop politically motivated violence, but it can broadly limit it and limit it to those areas. The massive sheer vote banks of the south, where Maliki hopes to get re-elected, are largely unaffected by that violence. But that does bring the much more poignant and much more powerful question: was it worth it? What's been achieved in Iraq nearly a decade after the invasion? By the time the US troops left Iraq in December 2011, nearly 4,500 Iraqi military personnel had died. Iraq body count, I think very conservatively, estimates civilian deaths as a result of the invasion, the insurgency, and the civil war between 110 and 120,000 up to November 2012. By September 2012, the Iraqi and US governments had spent $212 billion on rebuilding the state. So what have we got in Iraq today? We've got 7.5 hours of electricity on average delivered to Iraqi households. We've got the sewage system failing, fresh water failing to be delivered. In addition to that, torture remains endemic across Iraq's prison service. In both 2011 and in both 2010 and 2011, Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index placed Iraq at 175 out of 182 countries. The World Bank came up with comparable figures in the Worldwide Governance Indicators. It rated countries out of 100 on the basis of the rigor of their anti-corruption institution. Iraq scored 5. Contracts for rebuilding the Iraqi state are called the mother of all corruption, predictably, are frequently awarded to companies run by or very close to senior political politicians. They're used either for personal or political corruption. Then the lack of delivery of those contracts are then covered up by the political power. Against this background, I would argue, although the invasion drove out one of the worst dictators in the Middle East, and that's a hell of a list, it did so at a huge amount of cost. And if I'm right about the rising authoritarianism of Nur al-Maliki, it did so without changing the central dynamics of the Iraqi state: rentierism, militarism, torture, and corruption. If anything, corruption may now be worse than it was under Saddam. So I think that gives us pause for thought, especially as we move towards the withdrawal of Allied troops from Afghanistan, about quite what we can expect from interventions and the ability of exogenous forces to reform and rebuild indigenous institutions in the countries that they target. Thank you very much.
Toby, that was a hugely powerful presentation. I have to say, I was especially struck by the thought of a leader working through a tiny but loyal cadre to bypass a divided cabinet and duel directly with ministries. It sounded familiar. But I won't go there. Yeah, let's take Let's take questions. I'll tell you what, why don't I stand up there so I can see everyone, and I'll identify questioners. Let's start in the back. The gentleman with the dark hair, blue shirt.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. My question is, to what degree do you see this new authoritarianism being driven by personality? Specifically, were a different leader than Maliki in place, would the trajectory be different, or do you see this as somehow reflecting the general political calculus of the Iraqi system, regardless of who's in power? Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to make a joke about Nouri al-Maliki's charisma, but I won't. I don't think it is personality. I mean, there's some of us who spend a lot of time, both in Baghdad and when we've not been in Baghdad, looking at Nouri al-Maliki, looking at the way he runs his office, and looking at how he's managed to pull this off. And I gave a talk in this very room in the beginning of the summer, and someone jumped up and said, "You've insulted my Prime Minister." I said, "I don't think you've insulted him. I could actually be saying to be praising him." But when faced with a fractured, incoherent, politically divided situation, he sought to bypass it. I think the results, by the way, are very unsavory. I'm not proud of it. But I'm thinking that system, the rentierism and the size of that armed forces, and the fractured nature of civil society would lead any leader who wanted to centralize power, wanted to get things done, to do that. So I don't think it's, I think Maliki, if anything, you can probably enjoy me saying this, is a symptom, not a cause, and a symptom of an ill put together political system. An elite pact that empowered a formerly exiled group of politicians, locked them away in the green zone behind concrete glass walls, and then encouraged them. I'm not sure if that's encouraged them, but they then mobilized the population by reference to sectarian ideology, which in those first two elections of 2005 kind of bleached out any bread and butter issues, personality issues, or whatever. Sectarianism and precious as well. Ironically, in 2009, in the provincial elections, and 2010, issues, government service, corruption came riding back to the vengeance. And that's when we see that divided electoral result of March 2010. So it's not personality. I don't think, like in a Bond movie, I don't think Nouri al-Maliki is anything like an evil genius stroking his cat. What I think he is a fairly effective politician working through a very weak and fractured system, trying to outflank it and deliver power into his own hand.
Thank you. In the back corner, I should have mentioned it would be useful if questioners identify themselves before they give their question. In the very, very back, yes.
Thank you very much. Beit Kuba from NED. Thank you, Toby. Two questions. One, to what extent is Maliki independent from Iran, or Iran is playing a role in shaping up events in Iraq? And second, if one can go back in time, what would be the two most critical things, if they were made differently, would have changed the course of events, or is what we see is inevitable out of trajectory of whatever is inside Iran?
Okay. I used to say, somewhat polemically, that if you cut Iraq off from Iran and towed it into the Atlantic, the violence would still be there. But what I was trying to say is it would have been too easy to say, although Iran was omnipresent in the struggle, and we now know we're funding and arming militias, it seems almost too convenient to say this is all Iran's problem. It's not. Now that said, and I think we must keep in mind that as far as I can ascertain, Maliki wasn't Iran's candidate for victory in the 2010 elections. They'd seen him amassing too much autonomy and too much power in the office of the Prime Minister. However, the outcome of the 2010 elections gave Iran huge power for pause. Here was an Iraqi nationalist, flagrantly anti-Iranian party winning a large slab of the vote, and they swung everything behind making sure that Maliki would retain the premiership. There's a wonderful moment with Maliki, as we know, Muqtada al-Sadr, the radical Shia politician, is daggers drawn with Maliki, and still is, but there was a marvellous moment in 2010 where he swung his votes within Parliament behind Maliki, issued an edict on his website which said to his followers, you've got to understand what type of pressure I'm under. So I think the outcome of the 2010 elections ironically delivered Iran more political power, to shape the negotiations, and I think they are now calling in their favours. The use of Iraqi banks and territory to break sanctions. The fact that Maliki was 2 or 3 summers ago in an interview, I think with Lebanese TV, said, "I'm not going to recognise sanctions in Syria." The fact that he also said wonderfully, "Oh, we don't have to worry about Iranian overflights from Iran to Syria in Iraqi airspace because the Iranians assured me they're not carrying weapons." So with those types of assurances, one has led to conclude that the Iranians helped secure Maliki's continuation of funding, and they're now taking a great deal of payback. And the comparative autonomy of Maliki from Iran has rapidly reduced. So I think Iran's role in Iraq is increasing, and I think it's been delivered by events beyond Iran's control, but as ever, they're fairly clever manipulation of them. 2 critical issues, that's a dreadful question, 2 things that should have been done differently. The electoral system in the national elections, I think, moved to an open list system right from the beginning, if possible, possibly the postponing of the 2005 elections. I know you probably disagree with that. And I think the more robust building of of civil institutions. I know a vast amount of blood, sweat and tears was poured into trying to deliver electricity. And the delivery of electricity has gone up somewhat, but has never kept pace with Iraqi consumer demand. Water, delivery of fresh water is dreadful. So those of us in Baghdad in 2007, 2008 saw this kind of huge military surge wash in, and we were waiting for the civilians. And I never identified when it came, and I think you can see a comparable situation with Afghanistan. I think the US military is extremely good at doing what it's done, and has learned through trial and error before in reconstituting other people's armies. In Iraq, certainly, possibly in Afghanistan, I don't know. What the US government and indeed the international community, I think, is very poor at doing is reconstituting civil institutions. Those that people really count on once law and order has somewhat been stabilised. So I think the second thing would be to focus long and hard on how you rebuild civil institutions, how you connect the state to the population in a way that the population recognises as positive, treasures, and would then fight to stop authoritarianism in Iran.
Tony.
Kobe, you mentioned 900,000, and it's an easy thing to get schematically confused because they aren't armed forces, they're security services. And out of them, over 535,000 are in the Ministry of Interior and almost all police. But the reason I raise that is you've been there, and almost immediately after U.S. advisors left, at every level they started selling promotions, selling entry. The police basically had only 40% of the courts they were supposed to have functioning when we left. So the justice system collapsed almost immediately in parts of the country. But my impression is that this is a much weaker military structure than may be implied by its numbers. You have some elite units reporting to the Prime Minister. You have a good police unit of about 12,000. But out of that 900,000, more than half are low-level police and security guards, and out of the Army, maybe 2/3 of the Army is loyal to God knows whom for God knows what reason. I just wonder from your impressions there recently whether you'd either agree or disagree with that.
When you all read the book and when you all buy the book, and read the section on the reconstitution of the military, you'll find that the figures, you're exactly right, Tony, the size of the Ministry of Interior staff is almost double that of the Army. And that's indicative of the role of the force structure, which is to impose order on the country. I looked very carefully, and again you'll see in detail in the chapter concerned, on the capacity of the military, the corruption, promotion, sectarianism, and yes, it's an incredibly rough and ready army, and police force, as you'd expect. And indeed, as we saw with the national police and their role in the Civil War, one that and in the past has been hugely problematic. But on that basis, I would still, if that is your inference, I'd still argue that they're by far the most coherent and strongest military force on the ground. And I think there is enough there, and I know there are other people who I admire in the room who disagree with me, but I think there is enough there to hold a rough and ready order together. I think we're not back in 2003 or 2005, where there was a profound and very obvious security vacuum into which violent entrepreneurs stepped very easily, or entrepreneurs of violence. I think we're in a different situation with a greater coherence. Clearly it's not a modern professional army. It has profound structural problems, but I don't think those problems undermine it to the extent to which this space of lawlessness will grow again with the speed that it did after 2003.
Hi, Toby. It's Brian Nicholas, Center for American Progress. Two questions. Where do the Kurds fit in your analysis, and where do you see the trajectory of the dispute in the Kurdish territory? And then, second, given what you said about Iraq and its posture towards Iran, do you have an analysis on the Iraqi stance on Syria and where things are going in Syria right now?
Great, thanks. Part of that argument about Iraq not going back into civil war is a reference to an email exchange we had some years ago, so I thought of that. The Kurdish issue is dealt with in the book, and I didn't deal with it in the presentation if I really want to alienate the whole of the official audience from the room. But I think the relationship between Baghdad and Erbil, the Iraqi government and the Kurdish regional government, kind of writ large, this huge existential issue, and the Iraqi historians or historians of the Iraqi audience will recognize this problem. Now, you could argue that, let's alienate the Kurdish members that represent the Kurdish regional government, you could argue that from 2003 to 2006-07, the Kurdish regional government were in clover, and President Talabani invested a lot in writing that constitution that was the most decentralized, that deliberately and actively emasculated central government. And when we look at that constitution today, and this is for all you lawyers in the room, this is alienating you too, it has no role whatsoever in politics. I remember in 2007 spending a lot of time in the American embassy with a series of foreign service officers who were incredibly tired. They've been writing this law, they've been writing that law. Meanwhile, people slaughtering each other beyond the border. Why are you writing so much law? It doesn't matter. Or, there's a counter-argument there, to be clear. But last time I was in Washington, Masoud Barzani was here screaming about the fighter planes and everything. And one day he was told, shut up, go home and do his own negotiations, not coming to Washington to adjudicate. Beyond that, now that the Iraqi state has reconstituted its capacity and is a match, one would say, though, always more as coherent, getting it to be coherent as the government, then you see these things in stark contrast. Clearly, the big issue at the moment are the oil deals struck with large multinational oil companies on much better terms in Erbil than they could be in Baghdad. The whole issue of the strategic, the disputed territories. Now, lurking behind that is undoubtedly the Kurdish regional government's desire to break out to Turkey, the oft repeated but never built pipeline. Let us not forget, because of the deal done under Oil for Food, the Kurdish regional government gets 17% of the Iraqi budget, which is a vast amount of money. In my understanding, is much, much larger than it would get from its oil, even the most ambitious prediction of its oil for many years to come. So I think there is, should we say, a shadow boxing going on here between Erbil, loud, bombastic, signaling its intent to leave, and Baghdad, increasingly militarizing its rhetoric. And any glance at Iraqi history, massive draining of resources into that inter-Iraqi dispute makes one very, very depressed. That said, all Shahrastani or Maliki himself has to say is, let's stop the budget going north, and suddenly, the relationship between Erbil and Baghdad is put into stark relief, at least for the next few years. So I don't think there'll be, unless there's some huge Karmakin-like miscalculation, I don't think there'll be a shooting war. I think there is a posturing, ironically, with Erbil waving to Washington saying, help us, we're your friends, and Maliki saying we've got to do a deal. And of course the linchpin here is the rapid deterioration in relations between Ankara and Baghdad, driven by the regional issues that we've just described. But I think, and especially, I'll get to Syria now, but I think when you look at Masoud Barzani's encouragement, training of the Syrian Kurds, and you look at Ankara's strategic interest in the region, you think, how long can they play with it? how long before you get blowback and kind of Kurdish mobilization that directly threatens their interests? So I wonder the extent to which Ankara or Labour, they're flirting, but I don't think it'll come to marriage or even divorce. On Syria, and again there are a lot more people in the room who've looked at this much more carefully than I think it's a good point, but you'd look at that Iraqi ruling elite, funded, mobilised, delivered back to Baghdad by American forces of arms and taxpayers' money, and you bang the table and say, when are you going to make your mind up? You can't be aligned with Washington, even whatever Vice President Cheney used to think, and be created in Iraq. The Supreme Council's a big had in mind. What are you doing? And I think to some extent, the Syria dispute has made them choose. And Maliki's speech immediately after the events of the 2010 elections has focused minds, I think, and it is to do, and people in the room will say much more louder than me, the decline of American influence in Iraq has been rapid. It's to do with the status quo. Let's not forget some of the previous administration, not this one. But in a way, it was inevitable, I think. But, and I'm both a political scientist and a historian, and I studied this very closely in Britain's relationships with Iraq in the 20s and 30s. A similar process of the occupier, the state builder, all the blood and treasure we spent, why don't you love us? Because of all the blood and treasure we spent. We want our own independence. And what Maliki's trying to do is steer that course. And of course, the the big, powerful neighbour next door is going to have much more focus. So Tony was saying, one bullet election, where's that bullet going to come from? It's not going to come from DC. It could come from Iran much more likely. So Maliki is aware of his vulnerability. And I think Syria is the thing that nails that. Now, no one can control that border or set that border. The US tried and couldn't. I think the familial, geographical, cultural interaction between Iraqis of the northwest and the Syrians means that that's an ongoing problem. And indeed, conventional wisdom and governments understand now would say that the Assad regime's demise is not imminent. The regime may have as long as a year or 2 years left in it on a kind of warlord geographical containment basis. That makes this very difficult for Iraq. But at the moment, the Iraqis have decided, the Iraqi government, Maliki's decided to align himself with Tehran and clear his policy, and there is a net outflow, as far as I understand it, of jihadis and weapons going into Syria. Now that may well come back, but not yet, and not in the near future. And a politician, faced with all the problems that Maliki's got, is playing off immediate problems against long-term instability.
Second row back. Yes.
Hi, I'm Ms. Yunus from the Harvard Kennedy School. I want to ask how popular you think Maliki is in his core constituency, and given the current political crisis in Iraq, could there be a successful challenge to his leadership? And if there is, who might emerge as that challenger?
Right, two great questions. And
you're losing the mics on two.
Two great questions and two very difficult ones, so I thank you for that. If you look at the opinion poll data, you see that Maliki is very popular. The last time I read the opinion poll was in his core constituency. That he seems to have, like a strong populist leader, pushed the problems of the state onto other people. And within his core constituency, I think has managed to keep a degree of popularity. The extent to which that can go on, the extent to which he can posture as a strong leader, delivering order as opposed to delivering electricity and water, I would wonder, and I think, and he wonders that as well, otherwise moving against Isawi, we assume on the basis of that coalition for the provincial elections, the increasing authoritarian rhetoric, the attacks on the High Electoral Council doesn't look to me, unlike in 2010, as a politician who thinks he's got a great vote-winning vehicle. Where would the challenge come from? Well, optimists and pessimists. So if we were working in Steve's former organisation, or indeed in the office of the Vice President, we may be optimists and we say it's the next two elections that matter, the provincials and then the nationals. If we can somehow protect the High Electoral Council, if we can guarantee a free vote, Maliki's going. I'm not that optimistic. And if I'm reading correctly the direction of travel of Iraqi politics, Maliki is hoovering up independent institutions, breaking their capacity, and, more brutally, hoovering up politicians. Now, Hashemi was arrested and driven into exile after he came out powerfully in favour of federalism as a way of limiting the power of Baghdad. And Asari was intimidated and his house raided after he joined that electoral coalition. I think Maliki is moving towards shaping the terrain. The elections will probably happen, but the outcome won't be in doubt. What scientists call comparative authoritarianism. The recent vote in Parliament, I think, is indicative. It's interesting that politicians on both sides of that, particularly all three sides of the Iraqi aisle, as it were, to get complex, were happy to vote for the termination. Were happy to vote for the termination after 2 terms. He can't run for a 3rd term. That's a depersonalised statement. It's also a statement because of the way parliamentary powers have been reduced. That has consequences, no doubt, but not the consequences they wanted. So I don't think I think a challenge through the ballot box will be extremely limited. I think a challenge through the Parliament, a vote of no confidence, I don't see the majority there. And so where does the challenge come from? We're back, I think, to Professor Corden's one-bullet elections, or onto a consolidation of authoritarianism, which, given the cover of that book, means I won't be going back to Baghdad for the next 10 years.
Sir.
Shelby, you didn't talk about Muqtada Sadr. People tell me that today Muqtada Sadr and his people are well organized, that he was the kingmaker in 2010, that if Maliki didn't get the backing of Sadr, Maliki would not be the prime minister. And in the next coming year, that Muqtada Sadr, he aligns himself with Iraqi, and now he's sending messages to the Iraqi that, I understand your grievances. So where do you see Muqtada Sadr?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I'll be pedantic. I don't think he was the kingmaker in 2010 in as much as he didn't do it under his own impetus. Tehran, if he was the kingmaker, it was with Tehran's finger in his back, pushing him towards that conclusion. I think he's hugely mercurial. I think he's also anthropological. He's got the biggest ears in Iraq, as it were. He listens to his core constituency very effectively, and we've repeatedly, whoever we are at any given moment, got in trouble by underestimating his capacity, his organisational and popular rhetoric. That said, there are limits, I think profound limits. It's an unfortunate metaphor, but could you see Muqtada getting into bed with Iraqi when his forces were one of the main proponents and slaughterers of the Iraqi civil war? It's a difficult marriage to see. Secondly, when we see his role in attempts to unseat Maliki, he's been vocal, but again, he's been mercurial, I think. So I think he is the main threat to Maliki's massive vote, but I think his organisation, his position, he's got his vote is, I think, still fairly constrained to what we call the sons of the soil, the kind of, what we used to call in the old days the lumpen proletariat, the kind of underemployed, poor urban constituency, where Maliki tries to appeal to those in a kind of wider middle-class Shia constituency. So we have an interesting fault line in the next elections, if and when they take place. And we also have, Sadr's links with Qom and with the Iranian regime as well, which means seeing him as a king destroyer, a king breaker in this case, I think it's too early, and I think he's too mercurial, and I think his interests are too murky for me to say that, and his organisational capacity with any great sense. I think if we're looking for Muqtada al-Sadr to liberate the Iraqi population from Maliki, we're in more trouble.
Sort of a kind of a beard.
Thank you, Toby. Chris Arders, MMA. I wanted to pick up on your comment about Maliki being perhaps a symptom and not a cause. My years in Iraq, I heard again and again, people would tell me, I don't particularly like Maliki, but he's a powerful man, and I respect his power. Iraqis respect a powerful leader. To what extent, given this constitution and the way that the government is set up, do you think that any Iraqi leader, given the reins of power, would have seized the centralized power to this extent? And I want to also pick up on Brian's comment about the Kurds. To what extent do you give the Kurds leadership somewhat credit for being able to reign in Maliki to the extent of the oil contracts and being able to hold their autonomy in their region without having to concede oil contracts and the status of Kirkuk. Thank you.
Well, I think that the argument that Iraqis respect a powerful leader after the horror and the carnage that that population has gone through, I think what Iraqis respect is the delivery of some level of predictability and order, and who can blame them for that? And Maliki I think Maliki's been very effective in spinning or in linking his rule with that delivery. And if we break it down, we can see actually certain decisions he's taken in terms of the military and the intelligence services have directly undermined the delivery of order. So yes, I think, but you're right, he does have a residual popularity, and he courts that, doesn't he, through the overt and covert use of sectarian rhetoric. You know, the Ba'athist threat, with all due respect to people in the room who've suffered under Ba'athism, dreadfully, the idea that a Ba'ath party disbanded in 2003, harried ever since by the security services and universally reviled for its corruption and brutality, has composed any threat to Iraqi politics is ludicrous. And yet, in 2010 and every year since the Iraqi threat, like some kind of puppet, Punch and Judy, has been brought out to scare and supposedly solidify Maliki's electorate. Because when you can't deliver government services, when law and order looks at the very mildest, shaky, what better than the horrors of the past to do that? So I think Maliki is ironically he's a better rhetorician than he is a tactician in that sense. I thought he'd overreached himself with Hashemi, but he's clearly overreached himself with Assawi. But you look at the other members of the ruling elite, isn't it fascinating? I mean, they have no. We'll get to the Kurds in a minute. You think, right, go next. What are you doing? I interviewed a series of very senior Kurdish politicians throughout last summer. Oh, yes, he's got to go. Well, you can do it. No, it's for others to do it. But, you know, after Hashemi, he's coming for you, and you're doing that. You know, so there is a sense of strategic incoherence, which again is understandable, but is somewhat frustrating. So, yeah, through Baghdad, we've done, and ask the average Baghdadi, or Basrawi, or Mosul, or some of Mosul, what they think of the Kurdish regional government. You're going to get, if that person isn't a Kurd, and sometimes even if they are, you're going to get a very sharp and negative answer. And I think, to some extent, the Kurdish regional government can stand up and say, look, we told you so, and you did nothing to prevent it. You were more worried in November at the Erbil agreement about Iraqi than you were about him. Again, strategic incoherence. So, yes, I think looking at Iraqi politics in the round now, the Kurdish regional government, especially the KDP, has the most comparative autonomy against Maliki, and it's clearly a break on it, and he clearly recognises that. But that 17% of the budget leaves it very low and can be turned off. And what they're trying clearly is to mobilise Iraq oil contracts. But, you know, so they say, right, Kurdish regional government policy is we'd rather be a vassal state of Ankara than Baghdad. Well, you know, as the Israelis say, in a tough region you can't choose your friends. But you could have, and indeed, speak well of Talabani, that he took, I think, a cost to the UK and to himself. He went down to Baghdad and played for a long time on a national stage, as did Foreign Minister Zubair. And that great cost and risk. But they have tried, but I think they've made a series of mistakes that have led them very vulnerable. And the temptation is always to run to Washington. Don't sell them F-16s. Why? You sort out your interests, we'll sort out ours.
Thank you. Steve, congratulations, and Toby, you're always terrific. With Talabani probably out of the picture for good, he's a good wheeler-dealer and a deal maker. And Barzani being more the mountain man, extremely angry at Maliki. How do you think that's going to impact the national scene and the Kurdish posture in general?
There's always a tendency, I suppose, understandable, to speak well of the ill. Let me buck that. I've just been, positive about Talabani. Let me also be negative. I think, when President Obama was reported to ring him up and say, "For the sake of your country, sir, can you give up the presidency?" So he said no. Yeah, I think there is a series of problems. The Constitution was written in his house by his paid foreign advisors, and look what a mess that made. So he is a wheeler-dealer, but you want to, the classic example, when that vote of no confidence was being assembled in the spring and summer of last year, what was Talabani doing? My reading of the situation, he was doing everything to prevent it. Why? We know his loyalties are geographically spread, as it were. So yes, he took some brave moves. He's played a national role, and he'll be, his place in history, I think, is positively secured. But let's not get carried away just because the gentleman's ill that he played a wholly positive role. I think, to some extent, the inference in your question is right. When Talabani does go, maybe Barham Saleh, who knows who's next? Maybe, heaven forbid, not occur in the presidency. Now, there's a shocking thought. Why not, indeed? In that sense, Barzani is a passionate, quite frequently angry man, but when I'm passionate and angry, I'm limited by realities, maybe geography, whatever it is. With him, gravity, I was going to say, with him, geography, and I think his rhetoric is very powerful. But although personally he tends to get carried away, he's also constrained by advisors, whatever. There is a group of young and not so young, actually, Harami people around him who are pushing full speed ahead for independence. And when you say, but what about your financial dependence on Baghdad, it all goes quiet. And I think, as I'm trying to prove, our friends in the north are better served by frank advice than mollycoddling or they have a problem. And it's a problem we all deeply empathise with, although to some extent regarding the on themselves. And their solution to that problem is clear, they're telegraphing it. But I do wonder, in their oil policy and in their regional relations, if they're not getting carried away. And it would be, Kurdish independence for the country is great, no problem. And ironically, quite a lot of Iraqis, no problem with that. So go. Stop taking our 70%, do your own oil deal. And then suddenly it's not. So there is a flirtation with the big move, but not a delivery. And I think, if you did, I haven't seen any opinion poll data on this, but I suspect that the vast majority of Iraqis in South Central Iraq said fine, with our blessing. Now, what do you do about that?
We'll go back. Yes.
Yes, Greg Aftandilian, Center for National Policy. My question deals with the Iraqi Sunni element. How do they view Maliki at this point? Do they see him as just a strong man trying to become a new authoritarian, or do they see him pursuing a sectarian agenda, or is it just a matter of both at this point?
It's both, I think. If you look at what the demonstrators in Ramadi and Fallujah are chanting, it's not polite, and it's very well, you're a dictator, we're free people, how dare you? I think they did, and they've suffered from a national prime minister of Iraq repeatedly using language that is designed to sectarianly fragment the country. Of course they're not happy, and they're worried. I mean, you're a minority, you've suffered terribly in a civil war, and you see a prime minister who briefly talked in unitary terms and is now again speaking diversity terms. So I think that they recognise and have suffered from the power of the Iraqi army, and they recognise and have suffered from the sectarian rhetoric. So you've got a balance there that's problematic for them. You could also say positively, they heavily invested in the ballot box in March 2010, got precious little through it. So it's a very alienated population. I just doubt their capacity after the Iraqi Civil War, after the awakening movement, after the biometrics of that movement were delivered to the Iraqi government. I do doubt their potential to be the seedbed of an insurgency that we saw grow at that speed, 2005 to 2004 to 7.
Sir.
Thank you. My name is Marta Saleh. I'm the US advisor for the Iraqi IISS. My question is, do you think Iran is going to continue backing up Maliki or possibly making the same mistake they've made in Syria by not rectifying the situation too soon, especially if the demonstrations get out of hand? because it seems like I've heard reports that Iran is actually looking at Maliki as a spent force now, and it's actually better to pull the carpet from under him and allow somebody else from the National Alliance to take over and quiet the street.
Who do you hear is going to take over?
Well, that's the thing, because Plan B and C, they don't look very appealing. I know what you're talking about. You're talking about like Jafari or Ahmed Chalabi or any of those, so that's true. But my question is, do you think Iran is going to keep backing up Maliki to the end?
I don't know what the end looks like. I mean, there are three questions there.
Okay.
One is Maliki a spent force? Two, what will Iran's relationship with him be? Who would be the alternatives? That's four, maybe, and a comparison with Assad, which I think are great questions. I don't think Maliki is a spent force. I really don't. I think he has a huge problem that's shrinking by the day. That the aftermath of regime change empowered a pluralistic, fractured and corrupt ruling elite in Iraq, and for him to move forward with his authoritarian designs, what stands between him and success is that ruling elite. What does he do with them? Well, we've seen what he's done with two of them at least, and we've seen a lot of them at a lower level running into different types of trouble. So I think he has a problem, but I think he has a strategy, and I think that's unfolded. So I don't think he is a spent force. I'd be really intrigued to know why the rumour suggested Iran thinks he's a spent force. When Iran, in my reading of it, was most ambiguous, or in fact anti-him, it's when he was not a spent force, when he was riding high, and they were thinking, my God, how do we, this man is no longer a vehicle for our foreign policy aspirations in Iraq. That's my reading of it, so I'd be wondering why. Then, who would take over? And this comes back to the question, is it him or is it structural? There's a kind of, so if Jafari or Ahmed Chalabi took over, if Maliki fell under proverbial bus, and who would be next, the clock would be reset. But I think the problem with the dynamic would start again, the centralization of power, the control over the armed forces. I think these are structural problems that delivered him. And that brings us to whether Maliki is Assad, and Assad Junior or Senior. I'll add that to your question if you didn't say. Neither. I think his rhetoric, even when not forced to, is hugely sectarian. When you look at Assad Junior's rhetoric, there was an attempt, Assad Senior especially, but Assad Junior attempt to at least a curtain, a decent drapery of unitary rhetoric. Assad Senior spent a long time building up a strong state, which is to some extent what's keeping his son in power now. Maliki hasn't done that. Maybe he will. Maybe with this bonanza of oil money coming, he'll do that. I have my doubts. So I think Maliki is in a weaker position than Assad Senior or Junior, and hasn't got the tool. But I think what he has got is a control over security forces and a fractured ruling elite. So we'll have to see what plays out. And the people say, why is it a new authoritarianism? Well, international politics have changed. So although we can unambiguously identify Putin's tendency towards authoritarianism in Russia, we can also identify the needs and explain why he needs to run through the electoral process. And I think that's the same with Maliki. He can't just send the tanks in en masse, but what he's doing is picking off senior opposition figures and shaking the ground underneath them. And I don't think there is an alternative. There is an alternative, but anyone who spent any time with, for very different reasons, with Jafari or Chalabi wouldn't exactly welcome that as an alternative.
Thank you.
What about Ayad Alawi? What are the thoughts on Assad over Ayad Alawi?
Well, he'd be backing Iraqi, or he'd be coming in. I suppose the argument is, I do find it difficult to imagine, but I know our friend for Iraqi might have more information for us, but so we'd be looking at either an official electoral pact, or more likely a kind of informal agreement, not to run against each other and then to unite after. Let's be rude to everyone. I think Iraqi, for very interesting reasons, and explainable reasons, have been strategically incoherent since March 2010. It's an unwieldy electoral coalition. One of its strengths is also one of its weaknesses. It has regionally powerful electoral capacities like the JFI welded in with a national figure of Alawi. But Alawi hasn't bathed himself in kind of forward-thinking glory since 2010. And I think that's led, Iraqi itself is fractured, albeit with strong encouragement from the Prime Minister. But Alawi himself has engendered resentment within his own electoral coalition. So the idea that he's somehow an alternative and Iraqi is an alternative, I don't think so. Iraqi in a much broader government, next government of national unity, which would be a government of saving us from authoritarianism kind of thing. That's a possibility, but again, I think senior politicians within Iraqi, personified by Alawi, have showed that they've got a lot of strategic and political learning to do if they're going to outflank a man who's been on a very steep learning curve since 2006 and has proved to be an almost instinctual and very smart politician.
Castro?
Thank you. Ben Lando with the Iraq Oil Report. I wonder if you could explain, in your attempt to analyze the Nouri al-Maliki of today, what did you rely on of the pre-2003 Nouri al-Maliki, his experiences? What did you draw from it, and what stories did that tell you?
Very little. I was going to say I relied a lot on your work, and congratulations on a wonderful product. But Ben, I'm not. So let me answer it this way. I'm a political scientist, not a psychologist in that sense, and what Maliki brought back from. I mean, there was a lot of. So still there's a lot of talk about Dawa being a kind of cell-like party, a kind of Bolshevik party, they're conspiratorial, and this is usually comes from senior members of the Islamic Supreme Council. But I don't till I see what he's done, and in looking and writing about him from 2005 on his debarbarization committee through 2006 to 7. You saw a fairly incoherent, paranoid, but for good reasons, and disorganized politician. And then you then see the Charge of the Knights as General Petraeus said, Maliki crossed the Rubicon, and then you see this very more sure-footed, more overreaching politician, I think. I wouldn't explain that about his pre-2003 history. It's almost trial and error. I think he was testing out what he could get away with, the incoherence of the system. He developed a series of both damaging but also furthering, so the sectarian rhetoric I think is somewhat damaging. I think the development of the Maliki Union, the identification of the cabinet as the problem and the circumventing of the cabinet. These are, I think, strategically very astute decisions. I don't know the man, I have no insight into his mind, so I can't tell you how they were come to. There's some speculation, and people in the room probably know more than me. But I think he has proved himself to be, by trial and error, an astute politician. And again, in both Decembers, always when I'm away on holiday, the phone rings and Maliki's done something else. I think at both times I thought he'd overreached himself. And he didn't last year, and it may well turn out he hasn't this year.
Okay, last question.
John Barry. I was with Newsweek for years, and it sank beneath the waves. Toby, fascinating presentation, thank you. Let me ask you a last question, possibly a daft one. Where does Maliki want to go with this? I mean, clearly job one is consolidation of power. Right? After that, what? Does he have a vision of Iraq as a resurgent regional power? Does he have a vision of it as the counterweight to Saudi Arabia? Is it clear that he has any ambitions at all for the place?
No, I don't think he does. When you speak to people who know him, and when I hear about how my presentations and writings have been received, there is an outrage. How dare could I suggest, or people suggest, that he's authoritarian? That here's a man who's been in exile, who's seen the horrors of the Ba'ath, and seems to be, deeply believes what he's doing is for the benefit of the country, but also what he's doing is dividing the population and consolidating power. And I think, like a lot of leaders, like Saddam himself to a certain extent, though Maliki hasn't got the ideological product Saddam did, I think, he's reacting day to day. I wake up with 7 problems, I'll deal with the first 5 because they're the most threatening. I think it is simply trial and error reaction to consolidation. I don't see a major grand plan. And if there was a major game plan, he wouldn't have alienated key regional players as he alienates key domestic players at the same time, I think. So I don't think he has a kind of ideological or historical vision of where he's going. I think it's reactive, but nonetheless successful for that.
Toby, I commend you for bringing a mordant wit to a very dark presentation. There's more of that in the book. I urge you to avail yourselves of it. And thank you very much for spending your time today.